Ladies and gentlemen, on a day when the Afghanistan men's cricket team created history and made the country proud by qualifying for their first ever Cricket World Cup semi-final, I'd like to draw your attention to the women of Afghanistan. The Taliban government will send its delegation to Qatar next weekend for a UN conference where envoys of at least 25 countries will be present to hold talks with them. Now, the Taliban have forced the United Nations to exclude Afghan women from this conference and have asked the world body to not discuss with it anything related to women's agenda. What's shocking is that the UN has agreed to Taliban's demands, sparking outrage across the world. Now, since Taliban, remember, returned to power, most girls in Afghanistan have been barred from high school and women from universities. The Taliban have also stopped most Afghan female staff from working at aid agencies, shut down beauty salons, barred women from parks, and curtailed travel for women in the absence of a male guardian. The UN spokesperson, Stefan Jurek, meanwhile, has said that the Doha meeting are part of a process and not a one-off, and women and civil society continue to be part of it. However, Tirana Hassan of the Human Rights Watch says excluding women risks legitimizing Taliban's abuses and triggering irreparable harm to the UN's credibility as an advocate for women's rights and women's meaningful participation. This, remember, will be the third such UN-led meeting in Doha, but the first which would be attended by Taliban. Taliban has not been internationally recognized since seizing power in August 2021, as US-led forces withdrew after 20 years of war. So how does this play out for the women in Afghanistan, and how does this impact journey of women not just in Afghanistan but the entire world? Let's talk about it on the show tonight. I'm joined by Ambassador Meera Shankar. She was the former Indian ambassador to the United States. I'm also joined by Mariam Wardak, founder of Her Afghanistan, an organization that works for women's rights in Afghanistan. Good evening. Namaskar to both of you. Welcome to Mirror Now. Mariam, I'd like to start with you. It's unfortunate that the Taliban have bulldozed their way into these meetings and have forced the UN to exclude women out of this and even women's agenda or any talk related to that from the Doha process. How do you feel about it? What is your take on it?
Well, my take is that it appears that the Taliban are leveraging their power to compel the international community to accept their terms for recognition. This strategy might involve using women's education and participation in public life as a bargaining chip to gain the legitimacy on a global stage. And by setting such conditions, the Taliban could be attempting to manipulate the international community to secure political recognition. Now, the fact that America ended up replacing the Taliban with the Taliban after 20 years of war, it's not unsurprising that the UN is bending its rules to engage with them. Engaging with the Taliban isn't inherently negative, as isolation would likely hinder any efforts to influence or change their practices. While it is disappointing to see the absence of our women activists and politicians at the negotiation table, it's not unexpected. And historically, societal developments often follow such patterns where engagement, even under compromised conditions, a pragmatic step for any type of improvement. I don't know how the UN will come back from the damaging images that it's going to develop after this engagement. However, it seems from a holistic perspective, a pragmatic approach.
Ambassador Meera Shankar, doesn't this set a very wrong precedent? This means that in future, whichever group, whichever organization wants to have their way around at global bodies, at global agencies, can just bulldoze their way, can force their demands to be met, and they will have to pay heed to whatever they're asking for.
Well, first of all, let me say that I agree with the previous speaker that it's a pragmatic step because at some level you need to engage with the de facto rulers in Afghanistan if you want them to change. Otherwise, the women of Afghanistan are just going to be subjected to more of the same. And they have been the ones who have been orphaned after, the international community withdrew from Afghanistan. Yes, it does risk legitimizing the Taliban, and actually the UN Assistance Mission Chief in Afghanistan, Rosa Otunbayeva, has said that she has met extensively with women and rights activists in Afghanistan in the run-up to the conference. And the consensus amongst them was that, yes, there is need to engage the de facto rulers and to have them at the conference, but that there should be no recognition of the Taliban government till, they reinstitute women's rights, women's education, and have an acceptable constitution. I think the UN is also nuancing its approach because, as I said, they're meeting with civil rights and women's rights activists in the run-up to the conference. But at the end of the conference on July 2nd, I think Rosemary DiCarlo, the political chief of the UN, who is heading this conference, it's not the UN Secretary General, will then hold a separate meeting with human rights activists and women's rights activists as well. So I think it's a more nuanced position. Okay. And I do hope that the opportunity will be taken to put the issue of women's rights on the agenda and to nudge, the Taliban government in the direction of not treating women as though they don't have any rights at all in an overwhelmingly patriarchal society.
Okay. Let me take this across to Mariam. Mariam, do you see that happening anytime soon? The fact that this might be a pragmatic approach, as both of you agree, but in the near future, do you see Taliban easing towards women's rights, towards the agenda of what concerns women, towards basic rights that women need there in Afghanistan? Do you see that happening at all?
Before I get to this, I do want to point out one thing that I remember your Minister of External Affairs, Jay Shankar, once mentioned on how the UN needs to be restructured and revisited because of when it was originally created. It's a key point here because the UN has violated its own resolution, the 1325, which is why Afghan women are now urging the boycott of these meetings. This doesn't mean that one should boycott the meeting. I just wanted to highlight this aspect of it. And going back to Afghanistan today, so the current situation, as you mentioned so well earlier, was that women and girls, particularly above 6th grade, are barred from education unless they're from the elite class that could attend the private education sphere. There has been a bit of improvement in the government sector, and so women are only employed in the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Public Health. Recently, there was an appointment actually in the province that I'm from, Wardak province, where the Taliban it was a token appointment, I think I can say, a woman in a private sector where she's going to be overseeing other women be included in the private sector. This doesn't give any indication that the Taliban are going to allow women back into the public sphere and open schools, because again, I'm highlighting this important point that it seems that the Taliban are going to use this as their checkmate at the end, where they will ask for recognition in order to exchange for women to attend schools. There are three portions of the Taliban that your viewership should understand. They're the old school, very hardcore Pakistan-influenced Taliban, which you fall under the Haqqani school of thought. Then they're the current Taliban members who are in mid-level appointments in the government who were working for the Republic in advance, and they agree with the Taliban mentality, but they also want women's rights and education. And then there's foot soldiers that have never been
Okay.
exposed to education and have come down from the mountains. Now, it all depends on which of these layers are going to be in power in the next few years. I feel that if the middle sector
All
continues to
right. So we'll
evolve
have to
and
see how,
educate.
this entire these dynamics, Mariam, play out in Afghanistan. But quickly, before I wrap up, Ambassador Meera Shankar, let me also understand from you, and this is something that Mariam brought in, and I wanted to ask about, was the fact that many say that the UN has now become redundant. It seems like a weak global body that doesn't have control over its own regulations and guidelines. Would you agree with that?
I think the UN has been weakened because of the sharpening competition and even conflict between the great powers. You know, the UN has only functioned effectively in periods when the great powers have been able to work together. Primarily after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a decade of unipolarity in the UN, and that has now come to an end. And we're seeing the weakening of the UN's efficacy because these contradictions and this competition plays out in the UN and prevents consensus on any important international issue. And of course, it is, as I said, there is a risk that this whole series of engagements should not lead to recognition of the Taliban without achieving forward movement on reinstituting women's rights and on women's education and on an acceptable constitution.
Sure.
I think these are the three issues which are crucial.
Sure. All right. So let's see how this really moves forward for women in Afghanistan. But hopefully, more power to them, more empowerment to them, and more, forward movement for the women in Afghanistan. I'll have to leave it there. I have paucity of time. Ambassador Meera Shankar and Mariam Wardak, thank you very much to both of you ladies for joining us on Nation Tonight and sharing your perspective. Thank you very much.